So I have an overwhelming majority male audience, which isn't surprising, I think, when considering that philosophy tends to be very male dominated. And I don't mind, although I also wouldn't mind more female viewers. However, this has led me to think a lot more about the male perspectives on things. And for a little while now, there's been this hot topic in mainstream media about men who, for example, want kids and families, but who are unable to. And there's also a general larger theme of male loneliness and mental health, which is often reduced to and centered around their sexual relationships with women.
I don't think most women can actually genuinely understand how lonely the majority of men are.
Yeah.
And you need to truly understand, if you're Joe Schmo, average in nearly every way, in Starbucks working, you ain't getting a DM ever. You girls will never be lonely. As much as you might be unhappy with the possible suitors, you can at least fuck about and flirt if you feel sad. There are men out here in the world who have genuine loneliness. And I can prove this statistically. Why do you think it's all the men killing themselves compared to the women?
And observing these conversations from the outside has been quite interesting because, for one, it's made me very aware of some general assumptions that most of us hold about how we think our lives should be. And it's been enlightening to me to spend some time empathizing with and delving into the specific male dimensions of loneliness as someone who is generally interested and afflicted by the topic. So first and foremost, I say this with the most love possible, but isn't it a bit weird to assume that we are all entitled to that special romantic and transformative love that makes you feel fulfilled and want to make babies with someone? There's this image of a world where we go through it looking for a perfect match. And then when the stars align and our interests intersect, we find someone who just gets us and who also wants to sleep with us. And then we stay with them happily ever after. I think that's the expectations for everyone on some level when we're looking for love. But I, for one, think love is quite a rare thing. The older I get, the more it becomes clear to me that it's not something that's guaranteed to anyone. I mean, I hope I'll find it, but I think a lot of things need to align to experience this very special type of bond, especially one that ideally lasts not only through having kids, but also your entire lives. And I don't take the opportunity to experience that for granted, nor do I expect my life to give me that just because I was born. Of course, we're maybe not talking about true love. You might say that this whole discussion is a bit more pragmatic, that it's about starting a family and reproducing and whatever else. But it is about true love, because in a world where women now have agency and economic freedom, the choice to engage in that sort of arrangement will inevitably be more free and probably be made more carefully than it ever has been before. And women's choice is often made to be the issue here, right? With women being less likely to want to date someone who has a lower socioeconomic status than them. And as women keep getting more educated, it means less men will then be picked. And there's all these different ways that people suggest that we should deal with that issue. Anything from economically incentivizing women to have families, to telling them to just lower their standards and settle down. That, I guess, is the male dimension to this entitlement, because from a female perspective, it seems uniquely chauvinistically entitled to expect women to be willing to marry you and date you even, just because they are a woman and you saw your mom marry your dad and they wrote in the Bible that there's Adam and Eve, and this is thus the way things have and shall be forever. Because not to be rude, but why would a woman date you? Women have been conditioned and expected to be good wives and mothers, not because they wanted to, but because that was the only way that they could advance their standing in most societies. So when they're not forced anymore, and we know that the average heterosexual relationship is still unequal in terms of emotional and domestic labor, then it seems to me from where I'm standing that a woman wanting to be a part of that would obviously not be a given. And the fact that more and more get higher educations, in spite of knowing that statistically all that hard work that they put into getting educated will not be valued the same as men's, they will at least not be governed by their partner, right? So they're going above and beyond to get that economic freedom that hasn't been available to them previously. And this, I must stress, is something that I think is a very valid choice, and it's one that men have made throughout history, but one that is just currently being available to women as well. And so for the first time, naturally the concept of families, in the sense that they are a forced construct of the patriarchal society, will also have to change. I don't think that means that people don't seek love anymore. I know no woman or person for that matter who isn't looking for love, but rather that we're at a special point in time where everything about relationships is changing as we know it. And that now, when both parties in a potential love match are legally and economically free to do as they please in a sort of extremely liberal society, we have uncovered, I think, the reality that true love is a very rare thing, and it's something that nobody is entitled to. And the other part of that entitlement is ungendered and perhaps simply a sign of the times. Because I talk to my friends, and there's that lasting vibe of entitlement to love combined with what I think is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what love is. Because, I mean, I'm no expert, but I know that the feeling that people talk about, the feeling that they do or don't have for someone, is not what love is. It's a part of it. I'd say it's a byproduct of love, but love is seeing someone and caring for them. And that's an action which needs to be done regardless of how your fickle nervous system feels on a day-to-day basis. So thinking that we all deserve to experience love is about as unrealistic as expecting to feel love for yourself if you're not consciously putting in effort to love yourself by taking care of yourself, standing up for yourself, and generally just being there for you through it all. It's so weird to me that people think this feeling should just appear out of thin air when it comes to romance, yet they would never think the same about anything else or any other part of their lives. They wouldn't expect to be in or feel in great shape without going to the gym, for example. I think we're quite used to being comfortable today. We're not happy, but we're not unhappy or inconvenienced either. And that, I think, has become our safe space and probably our collective downfall. And I'm frequently told about friendships or dates turn sour. Or even more commonly, in fact, I'm not told. Because it doesn't have time to sour. We just tend to fade away from each other cowardly. One day the other stops responding to a message, and that uncomfortable misunderstanding is never cleared up. But it's also never addressed again. And since we date online and spend most of our time digitally isolated, you probably can avoid that person if you so please. And people tend to go on with the thought that the reason that things didn't work out is just because they didn't find the one, or that the other person is defective in some way. And I know a surprising number of people who are closer to 30 than they are 20 who say that they've never experienced love. And yeah, it might be because they need to wait longer to find the one, but also it might just be that way because sitting on your ass and expecting love to turn up is an unrealistic expectation, and I think a little bit of a bad way to approach this topic. So I find it so interesting how we in general feel entitled to experience this very deep and moving type of love without being vulnerable and without feeling uncomfortable or inconvenienced by it, because that we don't want to go through that. And Eric Fromm puts it neatly in his book, The Art of Loving, I think, when he says that love isn't something natural. Rather, it requires discipline, concentration, patience, faith, and the overcoming of narcissism. It isn't a feeling, it's a practice. And jumping off from that, male loneliness discussions are often misguided, I think, when focusing on women. Not only because it very often just delves into straight up sexism and hatred for women, but also because I genuinely think that this is a very shallow interpretation and solution to what is going on with men. When I see the argument of incels about women not wanting to sleep with them, it's of course, at first observation, something that comes across as offensive to me, because I'm a woman, and insisting that women should lower their standard or be legally forced to marry or sleep with a man is absurd. However, after moving through that layer of offensiveness, I reach what is a very simple conclusion, which is that even if men did get to sleep with any woman they wanted by law, and even got their wives with no-fault divorce being illegal again, I think it so obviously would not solve the problem at all. Not because sleeping with someone isn't important and romantic relationships aren't important and wouldn't provide you any comfort, but still, from an outside perspective, it seems wildly reductive to say that the pervasive loneliness and alienation and mental health struggles experienced by men today can be reduced to simply sleeping with someone. Because if that was the case, then prostitution would have solved it, right? If that was the case, then the numbers shouldn't be as bad as they are for male loneliness in countries like Norway, where we have an extremely open and liberated sex culture, where hookups is very normalized. I think this conclusion about sex and intimacy being the solution is male-on-male sexism, or perhaps internalized sexism. I don't think it does men in general much good to reduce themselves to simple sexual animals, insisting that it is just as easy as that, because it overlooks what I've seen and experienced be a lot more important to developing connection and safety and belonging to our world, and experiencing love on consistent basis, which I find to be mainly about empathy and friendship rather than romantic love. Now, of course, there are so many other factors, many out of our controls, that contribute to our collective loneliness that we're going through today. But if we just take the overrepresentation of men being lonely and committing suicide, then I've observed two dimensions that I think are very different from how I experience womanhood, which are dimensions of empathy and of friendship. What I found interesting about the feedback that I got from my video when I discussed being 24 and having no friends was in large part that the feedback revolved around people connecting or empathizing with my situation, which made me both, of course, sad for them, but happy in a way, because it was nice and surprising that I could connect with so many people about that. But I was surprised at the second largest general consensus that the audience of that video seemed to make, which was a debate that was started from seemingly men coming from, I presume, a pretty hurt place, who were discrediting my experience of being lonely and having no friends because I mentioned that I had a boyfriend. The thought was, of course, that I'm clearly just bullshitting and making up being lonely and friendless because I have a boyfriend. Now, I'm not sure what having a boyfriend has to do with the statement and experience of having no friends, nor did I ever intentionally enter some sort of loneliness Olympics when I was sharing my experience. But the approach that was taken by some of these people was so aggressive and bullish and completely lacking in empathy and nuance that it very much stood out to me, because these men seemed so angry, and that seemed so pointless. Because here you have this group of men that were on some level insisting that they remained lonely and disconnected by putting down what is essentially just some stranger on the internet's rather vulnerable attempt at connection. It struck me that this was seen not as an opportunity for connection on their part, but as an insult or aggression towards them. Now, of course, this lack of empathy probably gains a new dimension if you find out that the relationship that I actually was in was not with a very kind person. In fact, I was never more lonely than I was back then, with a partner who abused me and isolated me from other people. But at that time, I wasn't even aware of it myself, so it wasn't mentioned. But it goes to show that the assumption that a partner is somehow a quick fix, or that having a partner means that you don't feel even more lonely than not having one, is very dumb. And that approaching people who show up vulnerable and non-judgmental with a complete lack of empathy definitely won't lead you to feeling any better or connected. I imagine these men struggle with showing empathy to themselves as well, and perhaps that is a way bigger problem than if not you sleep with someone. This lack of empathy is cultured in men through patriarchy, and I believe it's one of the main reasons that you struggle more with trusting others and opening up and feeling good about it, a la the fucking wanting to talk to wanting to talk to a tree instead of a woman debate. Like, you feel bad and you want to not feel bad, but you've probably and seemingly never picked up on the fact that spewing judgment and hatred is the least probable to make you any friends on the playground. Of course, if you expect being ridiculed and laughed at more than empathized with, then I can see how this creates a very disconnected and lonely world. And it's not one person's fault, of course, but it is perhaps worth trying to approach people in a situation with empathy despite your fears, because at least then you'll have a sort of shot at connection, right? Secondly, what I usually see as something that would make men feel better about themselves and their relationships are to have more intimate friendships above all else. Men usually have their closest relationships be their partner, which explains perhaps the focus on having a girlfriend, as opposed to women who tend to have close friends as confidants as well as their partner. I believe the world would be a better place if we all had multiple close confidants. I believe it will make romantic relationships better, and I believe it would encourage more men to take emotional responsibility in their relationships. Because I remember growing up and hearing the take, for example, that women are so dramatic. The standard pick-me statement that you prefer male friends because they fight less and la la la. And this is true to some extent, of course, because empirical evidence does apparently show that women tend to break up with their friends more and fight more with their friends, which you could interpret, as we did in the 5th grade, that it is the fault of women's character and their inability to be chill. Or you could conclude that being so close to someone that you can be hurt enough to wish to break up is reflective of profound emotional depth in a relationship. And why is that not more prevalent in male relationships? Men aren't innately in less need of emotional support and intimacy than women. There are just more barriers, I think, to it in their same-sex friendships. Of course, it's hard to create deep and profound relationships with your guy friends when you haven't ever been taught how to talk about your feelings. A lot of guys I know simply don't have the vocabulary, for example, to be able to say what they're feeling, despite obviously having a ton that they would like to share. Or even in some cases, they think themselves that they don't have a lot to share. But of course, if you've never taught the vocabulary or how to sort of identify different feelings and thoughts within yourself, then yeah, you don't have anything to share, or so you think, right? Including the fact that admitting weakness and vulnerability is antithetical to traditional masculine self-image, and you have a pretty hard start for developing any sort of emotional depth in relationships. Also, touching is not as common with men. like touching and being intimate with someone without having sex with them. And I think all of these factors make men convince themselves that it is sexual romantic relationships with women that they are lacking, when they actually just enjoy the friendship that a woman naturally falls into because of her own conditioning. I want to stress that I don't think it's weird that all men come to this, what I consider to be wrong conclusion about what would solve their loneliness. It is, I think, a product both of our general culture that views romantic love as something that is a lot more important than any other type of love, combined with the sort of patriarchal limitations that are put on men, which provides a blind spot for all the other areas of life that you could feel less lonely and that are needed for anyone to feel less lonely. Emoting openly with men is not something that's promoted enough. If anything, it's problematized. And I'm not suggesting that making these types of relationships with other men is easy, because I'm sure it's not. But I think it might be an easier thing to try at than, say, convincing women who don't want to be with you to be with you, because that might be the case, that women more and more just don't feel like doing that, and they should be allowed to, right? Because we believe in fundamental freedoms and all that. So yeah,